my brother. Thank you. Thank you, kindly. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think that's what I should say after that introduction. And leave it at that. I don't want to spoil it. But we'll take some risks this evening. As Brother Gaylord said, there's so many things I'd like to say, and of course I understand tomorrow's a work day, so I'm not going to go on at length. And there are so many issues confronting us. I think I will probably be a bit, not as much as on target as I usually try to be, because I just want to touch on a number of issues that confront us. I'm very happy to see what you're doing here. And what you're doing here is of immense importance, because this generation will determine the life or death of the African people. It's no more struggling for front seats on the bus and lunch counters and drinking from water fountains no longer segregated, struggling for affirmative action and those kind of things. We are at this point in a struggle for our very survival as a people, and the African people are threatened the world over today. This generation that we have coming up now, we are going to have to grab it by the ears and turn it around very swiftly. Before we struggled and we assumed that we would be alive, one way or the other. If we didn't win the civil rights struggle, we still assumed somehow we were going to be here. But frankly, with this struggle, we cannot make that assumption. You speak of history, and it's unfortunate that we don't study history the way we should. One of the things we should study in American history is the American idea of progress that many of us have bought into. We bought into the idea that things get better over time. And we assume then that over time things will get better for us, no matter how bad they are now. And that is an invalid assumption. It is not written in stone that life must necessarily and automatically get better for us. That we've indicated in a number of times before, regressions happen in history as much as progressions happen in history. Regressions are not outside of history. The destruction of races and groups occurs as a part of history. The oppression of groups occurs as a part of history. The enslavement of groups occurs as a part of history. So the idea then that because now we are not in slavery, because now we are not segregated as we were in the South and so forth, that we will automatically reach some point of assimilation with Europeans, this is an unwarranted assumption. It is not written in stone that we will be around in the next century. We will have to see to it that we are around. But the idea that it's going to occur automatically is not the case. I'm amazed by the parallelism that occurs between what happens in America to African Americans and Africans in America and what is going on in the world in general. Yesterday I received a journal, Daedalus, which is sort of a intellectual journal that covers a lot of issues, national, international, and so forth, along with other journals such as Foreign Affairs and various other types. As you can see here, here's the reference to China in transformation. How many of you have been reading about China lately? As a matter of fact, if you looked at last week's May 17th Business Week, you would have seen the cover story on China, the making of an economic giant. Some of you might have caught my address at the last address at the Slave Theater. Might have heard me talk about white global supremacy being in crisis. And we talk about white supremacy, and we sort of talk about it like it's going to be around. But as I said, you see, progressions as well as regressions happen in history. No civilization has ever lasted forever, even though there are some of us who mentally want to make an exception for white folks. You know, we think that everybody else reaps what they sow, but somehow white folk are going to get around it. You know, and many of us kind of have that idea, that even though Rome fell, Greece fell, you know, one empire to another fell, we somehow feel like the white folks are going to last. And therefore, many of us want to integrate and assimilate ourselves into this system because we think it's going to be around. And yet, if we look at what is happening right today, we will see that this system is in tremendous crisis, and chances are it will soon be passing away. And we have to ask ourselves the question, do we want to be wrapped up in it and die with America and die with these Europeans? Or do we want to build a new African world system? You see, and we have to question this situation. As a matter of fact, I was reading in yesterday's Wall Street Journal, also talking about China and Asia. The journal indicated that very much Americans across the board are accepting the idea, or beginning to accept the idea, that the 21st century will be the Asian century. There's an expectation then that China and those in Southeast Asia will overtake the United States and Europe economically and otherwise shortly after the year 2000. So things are changing drastically. China right now is beginning to approach to being the fourth largest economic empire. It's experiencing a tremendous growth rate of something like 12 to 14% a year, while the United States is poking along at around a little better than 1.5 to 2% a year. It means then that we have to face the question, African people, are we to rid ourselves of white domination or white supremacy only to fall under the supremacy of Asians? And I'll warn you, as I've warned you time and time again, because some of us get caught up into this business called people of color. We use that a lot, you know, even though the other people of color seldom refer to us. And we think then that the growth and development of any non-white nation means something for us. I will say that the Asians are going to be no more kind toward us than the whites have been, and may even be worse. And so the idea that the Europeans at some point will fade away, I mean, that's inevitable. They are not going to be on top. But the thing that we have to face is the fact that Africa is not being considered in these projections in the future at all. Africa and African people have literally been written off by all of the major nations in this world. Even discusses it, except to talk about poverty and starvation, and to talk about how it has regressed in many ways. They have missed the major part of the equation. They are operating on assumptions. They have missed the great possibility that Africans in America will transform our consciousness and change the nature of the universe. It is very important, though, that if we are to transform our situation, that we inform ourselves much more deeply than we do, ladies and gentlemen. We seem to have an allergy when it comes to reading and studying. This is going to destroy us, I'm telling you. If you go out downtown today, you'll find a book by Peter Drucker, one of the major writers on management theory and on corporate culture and so forth. He has a current book now called The Post-Capitalist Society. There's a current interview in the Harvard Business Review also about this subject, the post-capitalist society. If you're going to fight your enemy, you must come to know that enemy. And you must read. You should read the Wall Street Journals and the Times and some of the other business publications. It's very important, you see. And many of us, you know, we get caught up in our African consciousness, and that's great. But at the same time, we must see what is going on in the world so that we can adjust our strategies and tactics to the reality of the world. Power ultimately, you see, power ultimately is not contained in persons, but is contained in knowledge, the development of knowledge, and contained in the development of tactics and the development of strategies. Power is contained in the development of organization, the ability to be flexible, to outflank one's enemies, and to have a great deal or as much intelligence about the nature and organization of the enemy camp as one has about himself. And consequently, then, it becomes very important that we learn much, much more about what is going on in the world. Racism is fast becoming a secondary enemy to African Americans. Yes. If racism in America were removed tomorrow, we'd still be in bad shape. Yeah, and we'd still suffer from joblessness, homelessness, and many of the other problems. Because the nature of what's happening in this country is not only the result of racism, but the result of the tremendous structural changes that are occurring in this economy and in the economy of the world. Why do we call this a post-capitalist society? In part, we refer to it as a post-capitalist society because it is a society now that's based on information and information processing. Yes, sir. If you would have noticed, and I'm sure you have, and being in New Jersey, I'm certain you've noticed it, that the industries of this country are being shipped out into other parts of the world. A great part of the economic suffering of black people across this country is due to the fact that the largest percentage of our workforce is a workforce concentrated in manufacturing and in the service industries. Those are the very areas since the 70s that have been now decimated by economic changes in this country. The people in Detroit, black people in Detroit, used to brag about the good living they made working for Ford, GM, and the other companies. But those companies are moving to Mexico. They're moving to other parts of the world. If the United States finishes, and looks like it will, the so-called NAFTA accords, the North American free trade agreements with Canada and with Mexico, chances are you will see many more of the industries that you depend on for your living shipped out of this country. What will take the place of these industries as far as employment is concerned? This is a major question, particularly when, I don't know, about 20 or 30% or more of our workforce is concentrated there, and another 20 or 30% or more are in the services. I just read here the other day, whereas they used to hire from Jamaica 10,000 cane cutters a year, this year only about 3,000 cane. Why? Because they have cane cutting machines. Most in the very areas where we are concentrated, those are the very areas that are being most swiftly automated. The immigrants, the Asian immigrants that are coming here today are better educated than native-born American whites. Definitely. Asians have accounted for, since the 1980s, almost 40% of the immigrants coming into this country. 46% of them have a college education or above. This compares with 13% of black folks. Understand what I'm saying?
Yes, sir.
Even our Caribbean brothers come here with about 30% of them 4 years college or above, again compared with about 13% of native-born African-American males. We're facing a very drastic situation here.
Yes, sir.
If you read a bit about re-engineering, where companies now are being totally restructured and re-engineered, you see, we're not just going through a recession, we're going through a restructuring of the whole economic system. We are going through a restructuring of the workplace. So even after the so-called recession is over, the jobs that you thought you were laid off from will no longer exist. They just won't be around. Period. In fact, nations and business people take advantage of recessions and layoffs to restructure their plants and factories and offices. You see, and sometimes they may even be deliberately created as a means to restructure the economic system. The idea that people now will have lifetime jobs at corporations, long gone. The idea that you'll follow one career, gone too. You may as well think in terms of maybe 2 or 3. Essentially, the ordinary worker will be, quote unquote, a consultant. You work for temp agencies, the fastest growing business in the country. High-tech temp agencies. And we're not talking about secretaries and so forth. We're talking about people with full degrees in accounting, computer science, and many other areas will be temporarily hired, but rarely taken on permanently by the companies. There are drastic changes going on here. Workers are being leased to other companies, yes. Yeah. So you literally belong to the temp agency, and they'll lease you to work for another company. Re-engineering, a changing of the work area, is expected to eliminate 25 million jobs in this country. So yes, out of a 95 million job workforce, we're facing very drastic changes here. This is not any time for us to be playing. And yet I see our people are literally like lambs going to slaughter, completely innocent and unknowing of what is coming and what is occurring right now. Still singing and bobbing their heads to this rock music, and grown men throwing balls at hoops and stuff like this and playing boys' games. Yes. Seriously not knowing what's going on in the world. And the other world sits right in your face and right about it. You should read the material. When people talk about the possibilities, they talk about the idea. Will Africa survive? They write it off, and it's right in there. It's not hidden. But you know what the phrase is. If you want to hide something from a Negro, what do? Put it in writing. Put it in writing. Just put it right in writing. So, see, this is why you don't teach black children to read, and you don't motivate black people to be interested in reading. As I tell you, the academic problems that our people have in the schools are not academic, they're political. They just show up in the schools. If we were a real reading people, if we had powerful vocabularies, this country would practice overt censorship in its published material. But it can literally publish anything and everything because it can depend on us not to read and not to be interested. And not only publish it, it can put things right in front of our faces, like the Star Wars movies. Right there, where it showed as these producers and directors demonstrated in that movie that when whites think of the future, they do not see black folk in it. They have robots running ships. They have these created monstrosities like Chewbacca, you know, that's probably the result of gene splicing and this kind of stuff. All kinds of creations, the result of molecular biology and recombinant research, but not a black person in there. Right. Not a black person there. And when you read science fiction, and when you read projections into the future, we're not included there. No, sir. As a people. Education is not going to be enough to save you. Now, it's more serious than that. See, we get into this, get that education. And I'm not saying not to, don't get me wrong. But it's going to take more than that. You know, lining the employment of its own children. A recent reading about the employment prospects of scientists in the United States indicates that among new PhDs in the natural sciences, including computer science, but physics and so forth, among these new PhDs coming out of places like MIT, Stanford, and so forth, we are now suffering a 13% unemployment rate. Yeah. This used to be a situation where the companies used to sit up around graduation time and literally hand these people jobs. Right. They're not there. They used to get almost automatic faculty positions. These positions are no longer readily available because the universities are hiring the Russians, indicating that they have the right to hire the very best. So where does that leave us as a people? As a matter of fact, this country now is suffering a surplus of college graduates. Do not use this not to go, okay? I don't want you to misinterpret it, because the idea is not to get educated. The idea is to do something with it, to do something different with it, okay? If we are to gain power in this country and in the world, we must tremendously increase the number of college graduates, okay? But we're going to have to do this within another context, in the context other than the idea that we are going to college to get a job, to be hired by someone else. Right. It will have to be done in the context that we will be self-employed. And that we, of that $450 billion, only about $3 billion was invested in Africa. Africa literally gets almost an unmeasurable amount of investment from this country, from the world. Back in 65, Africa used to produce about, maybe 1.5% of the world's manufactured goods. Now it's down to about 0.2. So we have to face the realities that confront us.
Yes, sir.
You know, I'll let the others pump your egos up. I'll bring the bad news. Okay. You see, while we need our esteem built up, we also need to be real.
Yes, sir.
We need to know what's going on in reality. We're being then hemmed in by the development of Europe and the so-called uniting of Europe, the United States itself developing a free market system with Canada and with Mexico, and the Asians developing, the Latin Americans. What is going on with African people? I want you to get out of this nonsense called multiculturalism. Yeah. People pumping us now with that stuff. This diversity in the workplace. You know, all that kind of jazz. And so we get these kind of philosophies and ideologies whenever black people begin to approach an African consciousness and begin to operate on the basis of an African identity. All of a sudden, everybody wants us to become multicultural. Let everybody hone in on our stuff. You see. But when you look around the world, other people are operating in terms of their ethnicity.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Right.
I was reviewing the operation of the Koreans in New York City as a part of my upcoming book on power. Working on the last chapter now, dealing with power. And, of course, I keep files, and it's so good to keep files and keep files of current events, because you can see movements occurring that you don't see otherwise. Looked up March 22nd, the Koreans indicated in the New York Times that now that they had pretty much stabilized their retail system,
Yes, sir.
they had pretty much stabilized their economic base in America. They are now moving to operate politically in this country. And they laid out their demands in the New York Times on the 22nd of March. Right in your face.
Yes, sir.
Right there. What did they say? We want three things, and we want every mayoral candidate to come by and talk to us about these three things as a group. I looked at their groups, the Korean Producers Association, not the Multicultural Producers Association. Okay? You know, but what? The Korean Producers Association. Started in, I believe, 85 or somewhere back there with about 25 members. Now they got more than 1,000 or more. I saw the Korean Grocers Association. Not the multicultural, not the Korean African American, not the Korean We Love All People Association. We are one from New York to California Association. The Korean Grocers Association. Okay? And I'm saying this because, you see, we're getting all this multicultural nonsense while groups are operating in terms of ethnicity.
Right.
And we get it most intensely when people are operating on the basis of ethnicity. Over 2,000 or 3,000 members belong to this group. The Grocers Association. The Korean Centers for Small Business. Not Multicultural Center for Small Business, but the Korean Center for Small Business. What is its purpose? to take the new immigrant, the Korean would-be business person, from one step all the way to the end in establishing a business. Yeah. So they can be guided as to how to set up a business. I'm going to come back to this because, see, this is the part of African-centered education. African-centered education is more than African history and culture. You see, we've let people shake the public debate and base the validity of African-centeredness on whether we taught the Greeks. Okay? I'm going to be upfront with you. I don't give a hoot whether we taught the Greeks or any other bunch of white men. I don't get any thrill out of having taught any Greeks. What great pride is there to be gotten out of teaching Europeans who circle back on you and put you in slavery? How can your self-esteem and who you are rest on that kind of thing? And then we commit a whole lot of energy struggling with these whiteys as to whether we taught them or not. Screw you. It doesn't matter. You must recognize one thing about African-centeredness. One of the major points of African-centeredness is this, that the white man is no longer the final word. We need to explain ourselves to him or establish proofs to his satisfaction. If you are to remove yourself from domination, then you must remove the fact that someone else other than yourself has the last word. Yes. And that's what this struggle is about, you know. Whites still want to be in position of deciding truth or falsehood. So you got to explain to our satisfaction and according to our scholastic criteria and all of that, whether, you know, no, we don't have to do that at all. In fact, we are moving away from that. You can only dominate someone if you have the last word, right? If you have the final word. Right. Yeah. That's a number one of importance to domination. So you cannot get out from the domination of other people if you continue to let them be the final validators of truth. You must validate truth within your own context. I wish I had time to talk about some other things here. You know, truth and mythology. There's so much. And I see how people out there struggling to try to explain to these white boys, you know, what's going on. African-centeredness covers every aspect of life. Every area of life is covered by African-centeredness. Not just African history and culture, but every part of it. That's why I ask people today, what is the economic program of multiculturalism for African people? What is contained in it? Where's the economics in there for it? Is there an economic plan for African people in multiculturalism? Is there a plan for reducing so-called black-on-black violence? Where in multiculturalism is there a plan for resolving the family issues in the black community, high levels of teenage pregnancy and disrupted families and the other kinds of things? Where is the plan for a Pan-African economic system in multiculturalism? Where is the plan for changing the power relationships between Africans in America and Africans in the world and all other people in America and in the world? Well, what is this then? Some kind of little Pollyanna joke where people sing and dance each other little music and feel good about each other and tell each other little lies about how each one has contributed to America, you know, and how wonderful we all are, you know. So in the meanwhile, what happens? The Koreans are still building their system. The Arabs are still building their system. The Chinese are still building their system. The Europeans are still building their system. And Negroes are singing other people's songs. Why? Because we want to be loved, depended on. Isn't that how that song goes? Yeah. We are concerned with social progress, not economic progress, not political progress, not the changes in power relations, but how people treat us.
Yes, sir. Teach it.
Civility.
Yes, sir.
You know? So if other people are nice to us and smile when they take our money, we're happy. There's an organization called the Korean Association of Greater New York, the umbrella organization of the other associations. It's the human relations arm, mainly designed to deal with Negroes and other people, but mostly Negroes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. How do they deal with other Negroes? They heard that we were complaining about how uncivil the Koreans were treating us in these stores. They didn't smile enough for our liking. They didn't say thank you well enough, you know. And the Koreans said, well, you know, this is a cultural trait we have, you know, that's just our nature. But, you know, they created so much tension because we were complaining not about the fact that they own a great part of our economic infrastructure, but because they weren't nice to us. So what did they decide to do? Now they're training their merchants to be nice to black folk. They run special seminars in etiquette for black folk. Yeah. They even hired a black professional to go around and study their behavior in relationship to black folk so that their behavior could be improved. Because they know that a Negro would give up anything if you're nice to them. As long as you're not another Negro. You know? And if a foreigner smiles at them and, you know, is nice to them and makes them forget that they are black, they'll give everything up. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So they help because they study our psychology. And every time they abuse us in the stores, our old jacklegs run down there talking about unity and talking about how, you know, we can get along. You see, not about how to change the situation. And so we've taught them, look, be nice. You know, hire a few of our people and put them on a ladder and let them look down and watch each other, you know. Something like that. This is the game. Now they're handing out turkeys at Christmas time to Negroes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Oh, very cheap. Very cheaply. Because, you know, we need love. Our egos have been so damaged until the only thing we can think about is love. That's the only thing. We are obsessed by love. Strokes. Ego boosting. To the exclusion of almost everything else. We're caught up in feelings. Make me feel good. Rock me all night long. You know how it is. You know. And that's it. Yeah. That's what it's about. Yeah. And that's understandable given our history, but we got to break out of it. It has a psychological basis to it. But we got to break out of it, you see. It comes from being abused. It comes from having our ego so damaged, you see. And we'll get back to that in a minute, hopefully. But we have become obsessed by human relations rather than power relations. Yes, sir. You see? Yes, and other people are aware of that. And they use the human relations in order to gain power over us. Yes, yeah. So they hand out the turkeys. They give leftover produce to black senior citizens places now. Clothes that has not been claimed, they're handing that out now in some parts of the black community. But it's more sophisticated than that. Now they're handing out scholarships. $1,000 scholarship, $2,000 scholarship to black folk. They've even sucked in some of our leaders. They had old Al Sharpton down there giving the invocation at one of their major things there. Oh, yeah. Yeah, you got to deal with it, man. And then I heard old Percy Sutton over here the other day talking about unity on LIB as they were handing out these little $2,000 tuition scholarships to a few black folk. Of the millions of dollars that this community is taking out of the black community, and you can't hardly pay a semester's tuition with $2,000. Understand? But we're just bought for pennies and nickels. Just, I'm telling you, there's a psychology, I call it. I won't use it here, but we're just, yes, sir. I'm telling you, it's an amazing thing to watch. Yeah, it's amazing. Now they're sending, 20 black and Latinos, I think, to Seoul, Korea, to a university there every year. For the next 5 years, they're going to send 20 of them over there to be educated. Yeah. You understand what is going on here?
Yes, sir.
Now they're telling the mayoral candidates that we want a Korean cooperative in New York City, so that we won't have to buy our produce and other things through the Bronx Terminal Market. We want our own produce and grocery wholesale depot, so we won't even have to give the white folk any money. And now we got it on both ends. We're going to have the wholesale end and what? The retail end. And in this way, we're going to control what? Prices, and control the market, so that any other people and other people entering into the market are going to have to deal with us on both ends of the spectrum, and you're not going to get the advantages that you had before. This is what goes on. This is what happens when people think in terms of their ethnicity and operate in terms of ethnicity, and then talk to other people about multiculturalism. You see, the only other group they mentioned in terms of having a multicultural relationship with were the Dominicans.
All right.
And you can guess why.
Yes, sir.
Because the Dominicans are heavily into the food business. So between these two groups, you can tie up the mid-level markets and the smaller markets in the food business, as well as, of course, the supermarkets. Because in addition to making the demand for the cooperatives, they're now also making a demand for a rezoning of Manhattan and part of New York, so as to keep out large supermarket chains, such as Packmarks and other chains, so that they will not suffer the competition that these large stores will visit on them if they were permitted within the city of New York.
Yes, sir.
Okay? Yeah. But this is the way history has always operated.
Yes, sir.
This is the reality of human nature and what goes on in the world. We have not only been abused as a people psychologically, we've also been overprotected as well. In other words, children can be both abused and overprotected. Like a parent that abuses a child's mind and his body and still won't let him go out and know what is going on in the world. So while we were being abused, we were also being cut off from the realities of history and the realities of human nature and the realities of how the world actually operates. Not in terms of what we fantasize it to be, what we hope it to be, what we wish it to be, but the way it what? Is. And the way it is ain't nice. But you got to live in it if you're going to survive in it. And you got to get down in it and roll in the dirt with the rest if you're going to make it, I'm telling you. Or make up your mind, decide you're going to be nice and die nice. That's all, you know. You have that choice, you know. But at least be conscious of your choice and accept the consequences of them. That's all I'm saying. We don't have to get out here and compete with whites. We don't have to get out here and compete with the Asians if you don't want to. We don't have to do any of that stuff. We can say we're going to be nice, spiritual people.
Yes, sir.
And if that means that we will be wiped from the face of the earth, so be it. We have that choice, I'm telling you. And I'm not saying it's a bad choice.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I'm just saying it should at least be our choice. After we have considered the realities of the world that we live in. That's all I'm saying. But not a dumb, ignorant, unknowing faith. You're saying? This is the reality of things. This is what's going on. So they were saying, we're going to lock it up. The third demand they made was that the vendors be removed from the street.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Specifically mentioning 125th Street and Fulton Avenue in Brooklyn.
Yes, sir.
This is the thanks that Negroes get for supporting these people. This is the thanks you get. Support them, help them move into the shops, help them to come and own real estate in America, and so forth. And after we get in and lock up the thing, then say, man, you got to get off the street because you're competing with our quote-unquote legitimate businesses. About 12 or 13 days later, Mayor Dinkins announced that he was expanding the squad that deals with vendors.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right.
New York Times, April 12th or 13th, right
That's
there.
right.
Increasing the number of people, increasing the number of vans that will be used to confiscate the vendors and other things. That's stated very clearly in the New York Times paper. This, is a positive political decision and somewhat of an easy one because the vendors have no political constituency.
Right.
Very straightforward. You don't have anybody backing you up. The Koreans are organized and so forth. They can back up their claim because they have organization and money. But these people belong to an unorganized people who have money but whose money is not organized. And not organized in terms of power.
Right.
And consequently, we have to make choices. We can make choices against them because even if they don't like Dinkins, they dislike Giuliani even more. So where are they going to go? They're going to come back and vote him in because they don't like what's coming if he's not voted back in.
Right.
But this comes from not facing reality, ladies and gentlemen, and not dealing with the reality that confronts us as a people. We can look at any other ethnic group, whether you look at the Arabs, same kind of operation going on. Indians, similar. Afghanis, similar kind of stuff going on. Racism is not going to disappear from your world. And it's not going to disappear from the world of your children. And it's not going to disappear from the children of your children. Get used to it and get over that fantasy. Because it is a fantasy. It's a terrible fantasy. One of my books is called Awakening the Natural Genius of Black Children. In the last speech over at African Portrait Theater, I talked a bit about fantasies and how various fantasies can either accelerate intellectual development or retard it. Yes. Adults are motivated by fantasies as much as children are. Fantasy is not an activity of childhood. It's an activity of human beings, regardless of age. And various type fantasies have different effects on the development of your mind. Many of us as adults are still trying to bring fantasies into reality. Every man we meet, every woman we meet, we try to bring them into our fantasy and make our fantasy a reality. Unfortunately, they seldom cooperate. But that doesn't stop us from trying again and again and again and again. Yes. And fantasies, not all are bad. Some fantasies are excellent fantasies. The fantasies I'm talking about mainly now are what I call compensatory fantasies. Ideas and wishful thoughts that welled up from injuries to the ego that motivates a person to imagine a world quite different from the one they live in, particularly if that world is one that's very painful to their mental state and maybe even to their bodily state. The fantasy of assimilation is one of them. Little black boys and little white girls holding hands. Yeah. Major fantasy. Raceless societies, classless societies, and all those kind of things. But let's look at the assimilationist fantasy for a minute. You hear a black person say, they did this to me because I'm black. And we've talked about this semantic device. They did it to you because you were black. In other words, it's the blackness of your skin that caused the problem, or the sickness of the person. Did they do it to you because you were black, or did they do it to you because they were ill? Psychopathological, you see. Because when you say that it's done to you because you're black, the emphasis then centers on the blackness and not on the personality of the person doing the damage. This leads to terrific problems when we, as Africans who've been abused by Europeans, have seen them destroy one people after another, have seen them exploit and enslave, degrade and denigrate everywhere they've operated in the world. We still hold them up as models of normality. And when we differ from them, we too willingly call ourselves deviants. And a lot of it has to do with the semantics on themselves. Don't see me as black. That's what you are. You're standing right there. See me as an abstraction, a man, a human being, an American, whatever that is. What is that? Here you are, standing right in front of it. But you want to, look through me. Yeah. Yeah, who happened? As if there was a fatal accident. Yeah. Because our logic is, if I'm suffering because I'm different, then if I can remove all difference, I will no longer what? Suffer. So if I can convince these people that I and they are one and the same and just alike and different in no way, then of course they can persecute me based on my differentness. And so we set off on this endless fantasy of trying to convince white folk not to believe their eyes. And we go after it generation after generation after generation. Not developing economically, not developing intellectually, not developing in terms of social relationships and so forth. In fact, we don't even want to develop those things because those things motivate our separateness, we say. You see? Because in that great getting up morning, we're not going to need these black businesses and these ghettos and all of these things because we're going to all be one with the white folk and we're going to inherit everything they got. So why work on anything of our own? Yeah. This is, and that's that fantasy. It's very powerful. That's the reason why the King's speech was very powerful. Whenever you get that kind of response from a massive audience, it's because the speaker has articulated an underlying fantasy that is shared broadly by a people. Yeah. The speaker articulates more than represents something new, but brings out of the people what they already have. More than represent something new, but bring out of the people what they already have in them unarticulated. You say wishes and hopes and dreams. So we will compensate for our suffering. The ultimate compensation, of course, it would be that of merger. We'll just merge into these people. We'll have one of these coffee-colored raceless societies. You know, over a period of time. There just won't be any races. There'll just be these coffee-colored people, you know. That's another one of these dreams. You know, this is a joke. It's not going to happen in your lifetime or anybody else's. Look at Brazil. You got all kinds of mixtures, but what do? They got about 16 different categories of color and stuff like that. People use the smallest things to make differentiation. So if you wait for this great chocolate-colored age or coffee-colored or whatever kind of cafe au lait race, you can forget that one too. Besides, it's not how genes work anyway. No. But we have that fantasy. That fantasy is taken over us. Yeah. And while we were waiting for this great world to come to being then, we neglected the development of our minds. We neglected our movement toward independence and self-sufficiency. We neglected to change the nature of power relations in the world, to build appropriate institutions, to build upon the tremendous gifts that human nature has given us as a people. We have allowed our genius to lie fallow and to atrophy because we have been overtaken by hopeless fantasy. And how do you know when a fantasy is hopeless, or how do you know when it is damaging? You do a reality check. That's all. What we call in psychology reality testing. And so now we've been struggling for this great hope of merging and so forth for the last 30, 40 years. Now let us look at our position today and see what has developed as a result of pursuing this fantasy of merger and integration. Are the American cities more integrated today than they were 30, 40, 50 years ago? Blacks are more segregated today than we were in the 1940s, and more segregated today than we were before 1900. I'm telling you. Even as you have learned out here, I'm sure, once you move to the suburbs, you just move to a suburban ghetto. Yes. And if you're in a predominantly white community now, you wait for 5 or 10 years and you see what happens there. And so the black community has been literally isolated and blocked out and hyper-segregated. This is the result of a fantasy built on assimilationism. What about your schools? Schools better off? Are you in integrated schools? Has your educational system improved? Yeah, but we're still pursuing the fantasy. What about the jobs? What about the employment? What about the health of your community? Violence, TB, drug addiction. On what measure has the black community fulfilled and realized the great fantasies of the civil rights movement? So we don't have to make an intellectual argument. We just have to measure reality and look at it. In other words, then, when you see that if a fantasy keeps putting one in a position where one's life and survival is imperiled and in question, then that sign that that fantasy needs to be reconstructed or dropped. To a good extent, the movement toward Malcolm X indicates, on some levels, a change. in the way we are approaching the world. Definitely. We have no enemies because we are the love folk. The love folk whom nobody else loves. Yeah. Yeah. We don't see color. And in thinking that we don't see color, other people don't see us as color. Yeah. And we think if we don't see color, that changes the world. You're out of your mind. We are not suffering because we don't see color. We're suffering because other people see color. And yet you get some Negro think he's saying something major. We say, I don't see color. So, so what? You're still going to suffer because the other person sees you as colored. And the problem comes from what? That way. Not your perception, you see, but the other way around. I have in here, I just have in here, speaking of, just looking at our situation, imagine our situation here. Someone sort of brought me a map of New York City. The World of New York, I guess it came out of New York Magazine. Yeah, New York Times Magazine, November 3rd, 1985. And in this map, it calls Who Lives Where. And it gives, it by showing various colors, demonstrates where various ethnic groups reside in New York City. Now, when you look at this map, and they have here yellow for black and West Indian, when you look over this map, you will see solid shades of yellow. Solid shades of yellow. Okay? Only time you'll get any other color stripped in is where they include Puerto Ricans. I'm telling you. Now, if you look at any other communities, you see strips and shades, which means no other ethnic group is as segregated as black Americans. Even when you talk about a Polish neighborhood or this kind of neighborhood, when you actually visit the neighborhood, you will find a number of other ethnic groups interlarded within them. But it's the African American communities in these big yellow spots here that you see that there's nothing there but black folks. Thank you. Sure. And this is duplicated all across the United States, all across major cities. So what are we talking about when we talk about diversity and multiculturalism and assimilationism? How does the fantasy fit the reality? You see? We have got to then establish new fantasies. Yeah. One of those fantasies, of course, is the fantasy of nationhood. Yes. Nationhood.
Right.
Nation within a nation.
Yes.
The fantasy of the Pan-African economic system. Yes, a global African economic system across the world. This is not a compensatory fantasy. This fantasy comes out of the study of reality. And in maintaining it, it transforms consciousness. It transforms behavior. It transforms human relations. Because immediately, as soon as you decide that you're going to become a nation, or a Pan-African economic system, and African in America economic political power, you recognize then that you are confronting competition. That you will have enemies. We don't need love as much as we need enemies. Peculiar, right? What do I mean by that? when you decide that you must outthink, outcompete, out-organize other people, this is what I'm speaking of. Yes. This then draws on the mind, doesn't it? It means then, hey, if we are going to gain power and neutralize power in the world, we must develop power. That moves us away from the human relation psychology, the love psychology, to a psychology that's built on the development of knowledge, development of organization, on futuristic planning and thinking, you see, on sacrifice, on identity, on African consciousness, on competitiveness and the ability to confront challenge. It makes us reorganize our minds and our goals and our intentions and our values. This is what it does, you see. It makes us use the minds that we've been given abundantly by our creators. Yeah, this is what's about. But when you don't have enemies, when you're not competing against anyone, then there's no need for growth to take place. When you want to be taken care of by someone, when you want to marry the doctor, you don't have to study medicine. Yeah. Yeah. And in a sense, assimilationism is a form of marriage. And so you got black men wanting to marry white men. Yeah. To become their wives. That second in command. You can't live without me, can you, sugar? And you want to say, I need you. I don't know what I'd be without you. Yeah, wait, you wait on that, yeah? They need us. A lot of us saying that. Yeah. But, they can't do it without us. You wait around for that one, here. He's already bringing a different woman into the house right now. Taking your place. Laying in your bed. But that's another story. But what are we talking about? I'm using the simile here because, in a sense, the idea of men seeing their future as working for other men of another group is fantastic. How can you, as a full-fledged man, see your destiny as being a second banana to a group of white boys? It's an amazing situation. It's something else. Yeah. To be somebody's helpmate, to be tonto. Yeah. And this, you know what I'm saying? And you're willing for them to own everything and control everything as long as they hire you. Women have a lot against patriarchalism, the patriarchal system. They have a heavy case against patriarchy. And I have no problem with their case at all. But women, patriarchy is about more than an organization of males just to persecute women. There's more to it than that. Yeah. Patriarchy just wasn't developed to give women a hard time, even though it does. One of the characteristics of patriarchy is the ability of patriarchal system to get men to work together. Now, sometimes they work together against women. Nobody denies that, and that is not good. But they also work together against whom? Other men. And to a great extent, patriarchy was developed to operate as a team, one team of men against other male teams. Okay? When we as African people look at the people we are struggling against, for better or worse, each of those groups that we are struggling against now are still heavily patriarchal in their orientation. Brotherhoods of males. Whether we're talking about the Koreans, whether we're talking about Arabs, whether we're talking about Afghanis, whether still, despite the feminist movement, whether we even talk about white men, we are still talking about what? Teams and organizations of men operating and pushing against other men. And the only team that they can let a black man have is a basketball team and a football team, ruled over by white men in leagues belonging to white men. He cannot take that team spirit off that court and use it to slam dunk in the real world. He'll sit there and call himself a Bull or Nick or any other stupid name, but then when you tell him to call himself an African, he has a problem with it. And yet the principle is the same. A common identity, a team operating in coordination against other teams to win a game. But once he moves off of that basketball court, he suddenly becomes an individual again. Yeah. Isn't it amazing what can happen to the Negro mind? Put him on a court and he's a team and he's coordinated. Take him off now, he's not responsible to anybody or to anything. And what do the other people do? White men can't jump, but they own the team. But they control the league. They run the nation. They do the other thing. He can sit behind desks, all right, and rule the world. And the Negro is jumping and hooping. Why? Because there's a teamwork that's occurring beyond the basketball court. A brotherhood of men. Because believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, unless black males become organized and become a brotherhood, there's no future for black women either. And the teaming of black males is all a part of the teaming of the black nation. Men, women, children, and everyone. All have to be organized in this struggle. We must face this reality. This is what it's about. You may talk about why the white man does what he does. You can talk about him coming from an ice continent, and therefore he's cold and unfeeling. You can talk about his weak and recessive genes, and how he's motivated to protect his racial purity and his genes from being overrun by the black dominant genes. You can come with all kinds of explanations about why white folk do what they do to us. But in the end, they do to us what they do to us because they can do it. Okay? Because they have the what? The power to do it. I don't give a hoot what motivates this white man to do what he does. My main thing is to what? Stop it. To neutralize it. You see? Not only the white man, but the Japanese or any other ethnic group that dares think that it will rule and dominate African people. Yeah. That's why I'm writing the book on power. The issue then ultimately is not why the white man does what he does, but how can we end him doing what he does? Yes. How can his power be neutralized, and how can he be overcome? So I don't care what is motivating him, he will not be able to project that motivation on us. That means we must come to study power. We must come to know power. We must come to exercise it. There is no life without power. That's right. You cannot live unless you're empowered on some level. There's no way you're going to survive being powerless, being without. Power is the very center of life. The ability to do. The ability to maintain one's interest and life in the face of opposition. the ability to struggle against the forces of death, damnation, and destruction. Yes. And all life is a struggle against opposition. And therefore it requires power. And there's no way then we as a people think that we're going to survive in this world without developing the power to secure our survival. Yes, I know that some of you think you're going to jump up and be all spiritual and, and wish the world away. It's going to take more than that. It's going to take spirit, but it's going to take also what? More than that. While God said man does not survive by bread alone, he didn't say he could live what? Without bread. Yeah. So he acknowledges that man must live according to what? The Word of God. You see. So we acknowledge spirituality. No one's denying that. But spirituality is not the only thing. We are still a corporal, physical people. So we still eat bread. And we still must be spiritual. So we are faced here with a vast challenge. And we must get down to business. And we must take care of business. And it's important that we gain the correct information and learn how to process information. I hear a lot of people tell me, well, this book, I have to get a dictionary. Fine. Get a dictionary. First there was the Word, and the Word was God, the Word was with God. What is it? God creates the world in terms of the what? Word. Yes. The symbolic image. First comes the image, first comes the symbol, and the manipulation of the symbol, then comes reality. That's what we mean when we say man is created in the image of God, or the likeness of God, in that he creates the way God creates. This building was at first, what? An idea. An idea. A what? Concept. And then there were many words spoken about it. Yeah, all kinds of words written about it before it even came into being, huh? Words. And then when these words finally reached a plan, you had to go get an architect who had a page full of what? Symbols. Just symbols. All kinds of symbols. And from that manipulation of symbols, ultimately what happens? A building, what? Comes into being. Show me a people who cannot manipulate symbols, and cannot manipulate words, and cannot manipulate concepts and so forth. And I'll show you people who are on their way to destruction, and who are not constructing a world to their own satisfaction. You are not going to exist in this world if you cannot use words and symbols appropriately and effectively. You do not see a single culture in the world that does not speak a language. And whenever you see something that mankind has in common across all cultures and across all boundaries, then you must know from the Creator's point of view that something is intrinsically important to their survival. Things that are not intrinsically important, you see different cultures, some having them, some not. But you don't see a culture without language, without symbols, which means that symbolization on the part of man is of key importance to man's survival. And therefore we as a people must learn to manipulate symbols, words, images, and concepts. This is how these people continue to rule over us. They deny our children their symbolic abilities and capacities. Limit their vocabularies and restrict their word power. Limit their abilities to think abstractly and conceptually. Even get them to thinking. To think abstractly and conceptually is not to be black. It's to be non-African. And as I've said before, we got one group of people running around here trying to tell people that African people don't think in linear terms. Get out of it. You think in whatever terms are necessary to advance your interests. Yes. Sometimes it'll be linear, sometimes it'll be non-linear. Sometimes it will be abstract and logical. Many times it will be intuitive. You see? But the matter is, you don't deny any of the human abilities or possibilities. You know where to place them and how to use them relative one to the other to get you where you got to go. You see? You have to understand that.
Yes, sir.
And to think linearly, to think abstractly is not a white man's property.
No, sir.
How do you justify the idea of saying the Africans are only principally intuitive and non-linear, and then you're going to talk about the great accuracy of the Egyptian pyramid? Okay? It's a contradiction there. And you talk about Egyptian science and astronomy and the other things. No. You must use them all. So in the putting out this information, we're laying out a series of books. You're familiar with the developmental psychology of the black child, indicating that the black child is not a child who happens to be black. The black child carries in its genes the whole evolutionary history of African people. The color of our skins is not just a coloration, but is an outward insignia of the evolutionary history of African people, the cultural history of African people. It is the end product of all of the experiences that we have undergone, of the climates under which we have survived, the geographical circumstances to which we had to adapt, the nutritional programs that we have undergone over hundreds and thousands of years. So this is not a happenstance. The fact that our children walk earlier, talk earlier, think earlier, doing things on the first and second day of life that it takes a white child 6 months to do, doing things at age 7 months that it takes a white child 15 months to do. The fact that this melanin is used in our brains to transmit and to process information much more rapidly than the white brain is not an accident. The fact that we have a natural head start, which if we knew what that head start was and could match that head start with social experiences and educational experiences so that we could be in advance of the world, this is no accident. This is not that we happen to be this way. When we see this black child walking earlier, talking earlier, it is reminiscent of the time when the black man was the first to walk on this earth, to talk on this earth, to use his mind to build and to construct. And we see then that early history of African man, the first man on this earth, being repeated in African children. Let's understand that. This means that the basis on which we must act is the basis of self-knowledge. It means we must know who and what we are. And we must interact with ourselves in terms of who and what we are. We would not need Head Start programs if we recognize that we are given a head start by nature itself. And that if we then match that head start with experience, we would move forward and gain the power that is ours in this world. Our schools are failing. You're using a white psychology. You're using a European psychology. A psychology that comes out of European history and experience. A psychology shaped by that history and experience. A psychology shaped by European intentionalities, which is to rule over black men and exploit black people to the end of time until they need us no more. Yes. Yes. The psychology is determined by your history and by your intentionality. Where do you want to go? What do you want to be? What are you trying to achieve? You see? And now what do? You send your children into these schools built on another people's psychology, built on their time systems, and every culture has a time dimension related to it. If you don't know your culture, you don't know who you are. You got some Negroes who think that they can escape. They can escape the history of slavery by not studying. Oh, that was back some time ago. What good is that? We are living in America today. Yeah. Some who want to only read the good parts. The heroes. People who are into contributionism. Well, we contributed this, we contributed that. No, you got to read it all. You know? The part that embarrasses you. That makes you feel hurt a little bit. Yeah, that makes you feel a little anxiety-ridden. That makes you have to come to terms. All of that has got to be integrated into the personality. And all of that must be known if you're to know yourself, because that is a part of yourself. Yes. We've talked about it before, that history in the past is always present in the human mind. The experiences you have had as a child are operating right at this moment. Yes, the kind of people you like, the kind of food you like, the kind of clothes you like, the kind of fantasies we talked about that you like. The things that you're seeking in life have been basically created as a result of your own childhood. Your instinctive like for a person, or instinctive dislike for a person, is built right on your early childhood experiences. Yeah. Your past experience is brought to bear whenever you interact with another person. Sometimes we call that prejudice. What is it? A person having some idea or some attitude based on history or past information, confronting a person in a situation, using that information to judge, to evaluate, to determine. The past is never past in the human mind. It is always operating at every moment and every second in time. Where does the past live in a society? Is it left standing outside of human beings? It lives within the bodies and minds of people. That's where it is. It's not left back there somewhere. It's right here. It's right in your head. It's right in your body. In fact, your whole body is a result of what? Past experience. Manifested where? In the present. Yeah. What do we say about the color? What do we say about us as people? What? The past evolutionary experience of black people manifesting itself right here, right there. And manifesting itself in terms of the attitudes you have toward yourself, right now. Right here. Manifesting itself in the attitudes other people have toward us, right now. Right here. Yeah. So the past is not dead. It's not left behind. It's always present. And the idea then that you think that because you don't read it, you don't study it, that you're not affected by it, is an illusion. As a matter of fact, you're more affected by the past, not knowing it, than you are by knowing it. That's right. You have to understand that. What are we saying here? One thing about human nature is the fact that the very things that determine who we are as persons are those things that occurred during the periods of our lives we have the least memory for. The human personality is shaped pretty much by the age 3, 2.5 to 3 years old.
3 years old.
Yeah. And yet people cannot recall that time in great detail. And yet it is that time that lays the whole foundation for their personality. And the idea then, because we don't remember when we were 3 or 1 or in the womb, that we've escaped those experiences is a joke. We are very much under their power. That's why we become puzzles to ourselves. Why do I behave this way? Where does this come from? And we work hard and we can't quite recall it. But we have an idea that it must have been rooted in some kind of experience somewhere in the lifestyle. The same thing then occurs in terms of races and groups. Yeah. The influence of slavery on us is still operating, whether we know it or not. There are some of those who said, I will escape its effects if I don't read about it. When I read about it, I get mad. I get angry. I want to go out and kill white folks. You know, I just don't even want to remember this because I feel ashamed of it, or I feel anxiety, I feel all these negative emotions. So therefore I will ignore it, and it would have no influence on me. But it's had an influence right there, hasn't it? The very fact that when you see, unknowing takes energy. When you decide that you're going to ignore something, you got to put what? Energy into it. When you decide that you're not going to pay any attention to something, you have already oriented yourself in a particular direction. And even though you don't know that's something that's become responsible for orienting your life. You say you don't get away from it. So if you say that reading the history of slavery and reading our history makes me feel ashamed, or makes me feel this way or bad or this way and that way, therefore I won't read it. You must put energy in not reading. You must put energy in not knowing. And when you don't read it because you fear it, because you're made ashamed by it, then your behavior becomes motivated by what? Fear and shame. Yeah, by escapism. And your life then becomes defined by always avoiding knowing yourself. Yeah. And how you act with other people and interact in the world will be determined by avoidance, by escape, by denial, by ignorance, deliberate ignorance and deliberate stupidity, trying to escape what? Pain and so forth. Yeah. So the fact that you're ignorant of history and not knowing of your history it means that you're even more what? Victimized by it. To escape victimization by history, to escape the victimization by self-knowledge, you must make the unconscious what? Conscious. Yes. You must pull it up from the depths. Once you pull it up from the depths and look it in the face, reorganize your attitude toward it, correct it, restore it, and integrate it again into the body, you become free of it. It now becomes your servant. You do not become its servant. You now become empowered. And you can use then that history and experience as a part of your power in the world and as a power for transforming the world. For when you forget your history, you not only forget history and dates, you not only forget great events and heroes, you forget real functional things. Yeah. For throughout history, our people have solved great problems. They've solved problems of organization. They've solved the problems of teamwork. They've solved the problem of male-female relations. They've solved the problems of manhood and all these other things that we are complaining about. They solved the problems of economic organization. But when you don't know your history, you see, how those problems were solved and the means by which those problems were solved are what? Lost. So you lose power. You lose a capacity. So it's not just a forgetting of things, it is a loss of real power and ability. The Koreans use something called K's, which is exactly the same thing we call susu. The Cubans use it. Every other group uses some form of internal credit and some terms form of lending to themselves. We don't know the history of how our people pulled their monies together, pulled their resources together, and built nations for themselves. We find it difficult then to build an economic and political system for ourselves here in America. So a major coping skill has been what? Lost. And even though we have money, we are poverty-stricken. Because we have not learned to organize that money. And yet, in African history, are the very principles by which that money can be organized. Yeah. But we can't use it in the present because we haven't brought it out of unconsciousness. But other people have it, and they are using it as a power over us.
Yes, that's right.
We talk about, and I'm going to end here at 10, we talk about our young people and our young men having their problems. Manhood was not a problem in the African culture. Why is manhood such a problem in Africa, in our culture today? Because we have accepted another people's family structure and manhood developmental structure. We have forgotten our own history and have sought to adopt another people's history and the psychology that comes from it. We have accepted the idea then that it is the biological father's role to bring a boy into manhood. Yeah, because that's the way the Europeans do it. You see? Yeah. We've accepted the idea of the nuclear privatized family, which has its advantages but also places children in great danger because it is so privatized and cut off from every other support and builds a situation where a boy has to come into manhood through knowledge of his father, that as soon as you lose the father, the boy is in what? Trouble. Serious trouble. As soon as one of the parents is lost, the child is what? In trouble. As soon as there's divorce, the children are in trouble. Now you find these children coming out of disrupted homes and other homes getting caught up in crime and getting caught up in school failure and getting caught up in all other kinds of psychological problems and so forth. And we say that is the result of the disrupted family.
Right.
Yes, but a disrupted family of a certain nature. Now, we look back into our own African history, we will see then a number of African family forms that would solve this kind of problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
You'd find a family form where it was the sister's brother that was responsible for the sister's children, not the biological husband, not the biological father. So if you lost the biological father, you still had the real father there because you don't divorce your sister. You see?
Right.
Or you had the more general situation of where it was the responsibility of adult males to bring young males into manhood.
Right.
Not the father's sole responsibility, but the responsibility of responsible males.
Right.
You see? And so there are all kinds of approaches and all kinds of things we could use that are already in our culture and in our history to solve and resolve many of the problems that confront us today. And our children and all of us would not suffer the way we do if we would come to know that history. But see, the white man has associated that history. He's put a fence there and associate blackness with all kinds of negativities to the point where we want to escape this blackness. And in escaping our blackness, we escape all of the gifts that our ancestors have for us. You understand? A knowledge of African history would help us to resolve a great number of the problems of education that you're facing here in New Jersey and all over this country. Yes, you got children here. You're bringing children into a school structure that's not based on your psychology or your history. It has built-in failure to it. Even if you make all A's in it, you're still going to fail. Yes, because it is designed to solve the problem of another people, not of our people.
Yes.
It is designed based on their psychology and their history and their culture. Quick one, and I'll end it here. We got it.
Yes, sir.
African people are an oral people. We're very oral. Even though we were the first to bring about writing and stuff, we still have a great tradition of orality. And that's an interesting tradition. And it has a lot of good qualities about it. But we must face the fact that we exist in a very literate world. And a world of very rapid communications. And that if we are not going to make it based on word of mouth alone. tell my students all the time, you can't sit here and wait for me to say everything you need to know. You'll never learn it. You'll never learn enough that way. You got to read. You can read more in 2 or 3 minutes than it'll take me a half hour to tell you. That's right. You can sit on a weekend and read a whole book in the introduction to psychology, and it takes me 10 weeks or 15 weeks just to review portions of it. Yeah, that's right. You just sit down and read, you'd have it all packed in your head and go on about something else.
Yes,
But you see, if you're oral, then you're going to sit there and you're going to wait to hear it. And then when we give you the test, you say, but you didn't say that. You didn't talk about that. You didn't mention that. That's an oral statement. Don't you have a book? Don't you have notes? Don't you have libraries? Why should everything you know be something someone what? Said orally. Yeah, it ain't going to work that way. That's not what it's about. You got to use every means of information. You see? And therefore, when you have people who are heavily oral moving into literate societies, you see, they got problems. They got serious problems. They're sitting there waiting to hear everything they need to know. They're trying to memorize everything. The guy gives a test based on the reading of 5 books, and you're out of it. You want to make a complaint. You didn't say anything about it. But what is this thing? But on a deeper level, orality comes in part as a result of face-to-face interactions. You see, because we come from many areas where we inhabited small villages, and most of the people we knew were within walking distance and so forth, we could then get most of the information across by just talking to people and interacting with them. And because we belonged to tribal groups and close-knit groups, we shared a common history, and we knew each other intimately. So we didn't have to make complete sentences because people understood what we were saying by the first 2 or 3 words because they know you well enough. So you can just say hello, who, but they know your history. They have all that history behind it. They knew you when you were young and what boo meant to you. So you got to just say that. They talk about these guys in prison one time who knew all the jokes by numbers. So all they do, they didn't even tell the joke. Just call out the number. Number 41. People just laugh. So, you can do that when you share what? A very close-knit, face-to-face culture. So a good deal of the uncompleted sentences that we talk about that white children have, and the other kind of thing, is not the result of a language deficiency or an inadequacy in intelligence and so forth. It comes out of living under particular social and economic circumstances. In these areas I showed you, many of these people that live in many of these areas don't ever go downtown into Manhattan. Many of them will live their lives out pretty much within the circumscribed areas in these neighborhoods. Blacks are so segregated in this city and in this world until black English is becoming even more diverse from standard English than it used to be in the past. Because the interaction of us, many of us, has become more and more reduced with whites. We have a receptive vocabulary from looking at TV, you see, but the ability to communicate is a whole nother game. You see, we understand what they say, but to communicate like they communicate is another game because we have not been set up for that. So this oral culture, you see, reflects also our acting as servants in the society. Our concrete thinking style results from the fact that we are used to do what? Concrete things. You understand? Our orientation toward immediate gratification comes out of the fact that we were trained to do this, and after you do that, wait until I tell you something else. And we didn't have to know how everything was what? Connected. That was what? The boss man's situation, you see. And so consequently, you get people who have what we call episodic memories, and their knowledge is cut off. One bit of knowledge is not related to another bit of knowledge, you see. But this is not the result of stupidity. This is the result of socialization, of enculturation, you see. And you have to understand this. culture is based on a people who engage in a great amount of social interaction, face-to-face interaction. A literate culture is a culture that comes out of a culture of strangers, where people no longer can pick up the implication of what you're saying. So now you got to string that sentence longer. You got to add in what? Subordinate clauses and conjunctions and other kind of things, because you just can't say, one word or two words and they got you. You got to what? You got to lay it out. Yes, right. Contracts, all of this. This is a culture where you communicate with people you've never seen. You may never see them, but you may what? Write them and communicate with them all the time. You see? They don't know how you feel you got to what? Tell them what? How you feel. You can't get it over in the tone of your voice or the movement of your body or stuff like that. You got to be able to write it in, And he moved briskly from one side to the other as he said so and so. Well, you got to write that in because other people are not going to know that. You see what I'm saying? And yet, this is the kind of world we are moving in and the kind of people we move in. And what we expect then is, and another thing about the social culture, you see, an oral culture is a jazz culture. An oral culture, how many of you gone to church and heard a preacher preach the same story 10,000 times? Over and over again. People go to church Sunday, they hear the same story over and over again. But do they get bored? Not really. Why? Because it depends on how the preacher preaches it. Depends on what? The rhythm, the energy, the timing, the improvisation, the elaboration, just like jazz. What does that mean? He has a basic theme and what? Varies on the theme. You see, and turns that theme all kinds of ways. And this is what the people are waiting on. They're not waiting on the story. They already know the story. What they want to see is how you're going to do what? Handle it. How you're going to work it. And therefore what? The rhythm, the tone, the improvisation becomes more important than what? The information. And so if he came there and just read a straightforward story, everybody goes to sleep. And this is what happens in classrooms. Whites come in there and they just talk straightforward, we go to sleep. Because we want what? Energy, movement, rhythm, excitement, get something going. It's just rough, just don't deliver me what? Straightforward information, give me something, Beat a drum, make something. So what is it? Our people go in, and this is, our children then come out of this culture. And there's nothing wrong with them at all. Children don't come into school behind. They come into school where they are. That's all. But they enter into a time warp. They move from one culture right into one that's diametrically opposed to the one they're in. They're expected to adjust immediately to the new culture. We want you to behave like this, dress like this, talk like this, walk like this, sit like this. So, without what? Any transition time, any rationale. And when the child reacts against that, there's what? Hostility, resentment, restlessness, and all of these other problems. To a great extent, you see, the problems that are complained about are generated by the conflict of culture. School has a culture. A school is a culture. And therefore, the cultural conflict that school represents becomes a psychological conflict and a conflict with our students.
Yes, sir.
Students coming from an oral culture and a face-to-face culture are people who are used to talking to each other. And they want to talk to each other. And they want to have an interaction with the speaker. And they, but what is it? You come in and what? No talking, sit up straight, sit still, say nothing to me, and sit there and listen. Yeah. Now, while I'm not necessarily saying that we should not do that, we must understand the psychology of saying, look, we are in a world here, we got some problems to solve. We must then transform ourselves so that we be able to do what? Solve those problems. That means there may be times when we can't talk as much as we would like to. Okay? Or we need to sit and focus our attention longer than we're used to doing. Because the kind of world we live in requires this of us if we're to survive in it and to conquer it. It does not mean that we throw away our black English. It does not mean we throw away our rhythm. It does not mean that we throw away our ability to be social. It doesn't mean that at all. It just means we add on another set of what? Abilities. That's all. And it means that we as African people, once we add on that other set of abilities, we become broader in our understanding of the world and ourselves than any other one-sided group of people in the world. This balance, this ability to gain the world and also retain our souls will permit us to rule this world. Understand? And this is what it is about here. Not loss, but gain. Not breaking up, but synthesis, you see. As I've told people about the Star Trek situation, what do you have there? Why is Captain Kirk the captain of the ship? Unlike Mr. Spock, who's a one-sided, one-brain man, cold, objective, unfeeling, unhuman. You see, there's something missing in him. Then you look at old Doc over there, he's just filled with all kinds of emotion and pathos. He can't get a hold of himself. He gets carried away emotionally. Reminds me of some people I know. But what is Kirk? Kirk utilizes both of them, doesn't he? That's right. When he needs one here, he'll call them in. He determines the appropriateness of their use. At this point, I could use Spock. At this point, I can use the doctor. But then look at himself. I'm both a feeler and a what? Thinker. You see? And I look at the problem and I deal with it in terms of what it demands. We as African people then, we're in the best position, African Americans. We're in the belly of the beast. But we can keep our African soul. And yet we can also carry out of this beast those things that we need to survive and advance our interests as a people. And ultimately, we can slay the beast. Thank you very much.
Whoa! East Orange will never be the same.